All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for Tishrei Haba Alinu Litova. Yoel and Sarah Kelman for dedicating all the Shumer and Drushos this month in celebration of the completion of Seder Nezikin and for Besoros Tavos for all of Am Yisrael. Nathan Perry Smith in the schos of the entire Kiyar. Our week of learning sponsors, Alan and Sumaira's commission of the yard sites of their grandparents, aunts, and uncles, Avram ben Yaakov HaKohen, Basha Bas Chaim, Yitzchak ben Yaakov HaKohen, Fega Bas Avram HaKohen, Hirsch ben Avram HaKohen, Mordechai ben Avram HaKohen, Zichron Levrach, and Richard and Judy Nudelman, Le'iloi Nishmas Marvin Schwartz, a long time member and pillar here at the shul, whose levaya is this morning. Mechel Nachman ben Nochum Zichron Lebracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah shav and give of Kol Cholei Yisrael, the Kodesh Baruch Hu Sh'tem Yirtz Hashem, bring home all of our hostages, allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol Ma'aseh Yedeim, we should truly be gebenched with the year Besoros Tavos for Am Yisrael. We'll say, so we have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Tes Vav 15. And we are picking up Emir Hashem Tashma on Yudalam base 14b, 6 lines up from the bottom. So if you remember again, the Gemara was asking the fundamental question. The Gemara was asking, we left off, halacha shelo b'regel. What happens if halacha l'maisa, there is halacha without moving your feet? What does this mean? So remember again, one of the avodos is halacha, which means after the blood is received in the kli, in the utensil, ultimately, again, it is taken towards the Mizbeach. What happens if halacha l'maisa, that halacha is done without moving your feet, just merely extending your hand? Is that called halacha or not? That was our question. So the Gemara says, Tashma, shachat Yisrael v'kibal chakoin. So if Yisrael shechted the animal, and a kohen did kabbalah, nasna l'chavero, v'chavero l'chavero. So I say, interestingly enough, the Gemara is actually describing over here what happened by Karban Pesach. Essentially, by Karban Pesach, there would be like an assembly line. Somebody would shech the Karban Pesach, and they would hand it from Kohen to Kohen to Kohen to Kohen, ultimately to do the Zrika. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here, now obviously, Pashat Pshat is that no one's moving. Rather, what are they doing? They're handing the blood one to the other along an assembly line. Along an assembly line. So the Gemara says, you see from here that halacha l'maisa, that halacha shelo b'regel, that again halacha just simply done by extending the hand is enough. To which the Gemara says maybe not. Hasam nami denai porta. It's possible that even as the Kohanim were standing on the assembly line, perhaps they moved a little bit. So the Gemara says my kamash malon. So therefore, if that's the case, what exactly are you coming to teach me? Berovam hadras melech. This was quite beautiful. They set this up. Why? Because the more Kohanim that you could have, the more Kohanim, or the more people in general that you could have involved in a sacrificial rite and process, the greater kavod to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, again, the act of having like a line of Kohanim, with each person kind of carrying the utensil along, was a tremendous kavod to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But again, not a raya, not a proof, ultimately, again, to our question. So therefore, our question is still outstanding. What is the status of holacha shelo beregel? Moving or taking the blood to the mizbeach for zrika without moving your feet. Simple extension of the hand. Does that count as holacha or not? So Itmar, So Tashma, kiba hakoin v'nasal apostle. So we'll say an interesting case over here. Kiba hakasher v'nasal apostle. So we'll say an interesting case over here. So let's say a kohen, right? Literally kosher, so someone who is fit for holacha, because remember, we established in yesterday's daf that holacha must be done by a kohen. It is one of the primary forms of one of the sacrificial rites, and therefore requires a kohen. So now the Gemara says, what is the halacha if, let's say, the kohen did kabbalah, but he received it, and then he gave it to someone who's apostle. He gave it to Yisrael. So now, what's the halacha? Yachzir l'kasher. The Yisrael has to go ahead and give it back to the Kohen. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Yachzir l'kasher. Rashi says, "V'shenas nalo v'ashmoinan tartiba chadar delo mifsal b'may de'afsekei pasol v'ashmoinan bazed deholacha zu sha'asa kasher shelo b'regel shoshit l'pasol shahaya omei b'salam mizbeach lo na'asis be'achsher v'lo shma holacha." Now, we'll say, the way the Gemara is understanding this case over here is as follows. That what's happening? Kohen is holding the blood. He extends it ultimately again to the apostle, So the Gemara is learning two things. Number one, that act of the Kohen extending it to the apostle does not invalidate the holacha. And when the apostle goes ahead and gives it back to the Kohen, ostensibly by extending his hand, ultimately that is not an invalidation of the avoda as well. So both of these inferences point in the same direction, namely that halacha l'maisa holacha shelo beregel is not holacha, right? Or a holacha just of extending your hand is not the holacha. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Ema yachzer hakasher v'yikabla. Rashi says, or maybe it means something else. L'tzad mizbeach v'yikablena v'yitlena miyad apostle. Maybe not. I will say maybe ultimately again what it means is that the Kohen has to receive it back and ultimately again do the halacha again, this time on his own. So in other words, it does not necessarily point in any particular direction. To which the Gemara says, Itmar la ula itmar amr ula Rabbi Yochanan ula sedin Rabbi Yochanan halacha shelo beregel lo shma halacha. So we'll say, so now Ula comes along, Ula issues a definitive ruling. And what is the definitive ruling? Holacha shelo beregel, which means that holacha that is done, movement of the blood that is done simply by extending one's hands without moving one's feet is not considered to be the avoda of holacha. Now understand, this has two ramifications, right? Ramification number one is that if the Yisrael were to hold the blood, let's say, because remember again, we established in yesterday's daf, what could a Yisrael do in this whole process? What could he do? Maaseh itztava, right? He could be a pillar. In other words, if let's say the Kohen shechted the animal, or anyone shechted the animal, the Kohen did the Kabbalah, right? He received it in the Kli, and then he gave it to the Yisrael, and he said to the Yisrael, hold this. That's mutter. Yisrael could act just as a pillar. Now, Ula comes along and says, holacha shelo beregel is not holacha. Therefore, what that means is, if the Yisrael is holding it and the Yisrael extends his hand to give it to the Kohen, that's fine. That's not called holacha. Holacha is only called, ultimately, again, when you actually move your feet. Good. So we'll say, so by the way, there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in this also. What do you see from here? That the act of going ahead and extending your arm without moving your body is not considered to be movement. It's not movement, which is a tremendous lesson for this time of year. Tremendous lesson, because one thing that we're all trying to work on for this time of year is movement. So a lot of times we talk about movement, we talk about change, we contemplate change, we plan change, we even begin to reach out in different ways for change. Change only occurs at the moment that you move your body in totality, so to speak. Change only occurs ultimately when you move your entire self in a particular direction. It doesn't have to be far, right? You don't have to take giant steps. Remember again, holacha is even a little baby step. Holacha is even a little something. But not moving your feet, not moving your body, stretching out your arms in all directions, that's not called holacha. If you want to affect change in life, change requires comprehensive, total movement. It doesn't have to be dramatic movement, but it does have to be some level of movement. Incredible. Both at top of Tesvav. Efshar letakna, olo efshar letkuna. So we'll say, here's an interesting shayla. So now, what happens if halacha l'maisa, there was an illegal halacha that was done? Illegal halacha. Can it be rectified or not? Take a look at Rashi, Tap Rashi, Tesvav Amud Aleph. So, Efshar letakna, bein sha'asa zar, bein sha'asa kohen, aminan de'ein halacha upsula. So we'll say, here's something very interesting. Let's say a non-Kohen, a Yisrael, did holacha, right? So we could just frame this case. Kohen shechted the animal, received the blood, said to the Yisrael, hold this. Okay, that's mutter. Yisrael decides he's trying to help. What does he do? He starts walking towards the mizbeach. Kohen says, hold up, stop. So now, can the Kohen take the blood back from the Yisrael and essentially re-walk it? Can you fix the illegal act of holacha or not? Tashma, Kibalak Kasher v'Nasal Apostle Yachzir Kasha. So Gemara quotes the same rights we quoted before. Now let's say again, if a Kohen did Kabbalah, and then he gave it to a Yisrael. And then what happened? The Yisrael went ahead and began to move with it. So what's the halacha? Yachzir Kasha. So ultimately, again, the apostle, the Yisrael, should give it back to the Kohen. Unehi nami Yachzir Hakasha ve'ikablana. If Sulei. Now, the fact that the apostle could hand it back to the kasher. Now, obviously, the understanding from that is then the kasher is going to finish off the avoda. What does that indicate to us? That it is rectifiable. That in a legal holacha, ultimately, again, is rectifiable. To which the Gemara says, hold up. Mi sarvis the kai zar gavai, lo the kai zar berai. So we'll say no, because remember, we think to ourselves, what's the case over here, where the Kohen gave it to the Yisrael, and the Yisrael's in front of the Kohen closer to the Mizbeach, to which the Gemara says that's not the case. The case is actually, where the Kohen is, where the non-Kohen, the Yisrael, is behind the Kohen. So therefore, ultimately, again, when the Kohen gave it to the Yisrael, even if the Yisrael did a little bit of movement, the Yisrael actually did not bring it any closer to the Mizbeach. Maybe that's the case where an illegal holacha is rectifiable, because at the end of the day, the Yisrael's act didn't really do anything. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi is right across. Mi sarvis the kaizar gavai l'sad mizbeach sheker varishon ba'ushatas l'sad mizbeach. Do you think the Yisrael was standing closer to the Mizbeach? No. The kaizar b'roi. The kasher shoshita lo hirchika min ha-mizbeach. Hilkach lav holacha havi lifsal. So it's incredible. The case over here is where the Kohen actually gave the Yisrael the blood, and the Yisrael is standing behind the Kohen. So therefore, the act of the Kohen giving the Yisrael blood did not in any way bring the blood any closer to the Mizbeach. Instead, what it did is it actually distanced it, and therefore it's not an act of holacha. Therefore, once the Kohen gets it back, we're good to go. So we'll say, but again, it doesn't address our core question. What's our core question? If an illegal holacha was done, is that rectifiable or not? Seitmar, the Gemara says, Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, holacha shelo b'regel psula. Okay, so remember again, that's just restating Ula that we said before. Holacha shelo b'regel. So again, if you do holacha, ultimately, again, without moving your feet, that is psula. That's not navoda. Alma lo afshar letkuna. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That halacha l'maisa, ultimately, the lashon of pasal indicates to us that whenever you have an illegal halacha, ultimately you've compromised the avoda, right? Unable to go ahead and rectify it. So Nachman read the kasha to Ula, nishpach minakli ala ritzba, va'asfal kasha. So we'll say, here's an interesting case. So let's say again, so Kohen did shchita, although again, you understand, Kohen doesn't have to do shchita, but Kohen did shchita. Then Kohen received the blood in the kli. The Kohen is taking the blood, remember again, I will say, holacha, Kohen is taking the blood in the utensil to the Mizbeach. When he gets to the Mizbeach, what is he going to do? Zrika, he's going to sprinkle it. As he's going ahead and taking the blood, what happens? He spills it. He spills the blood. So Gemara says, Nishbach minakli ala ritzpa va'asfo. He collects the blood back up. Ultimately, again, it's kasher. Right? Don't cry over spilled blood. Right? So the Gemara says, so he goes ahead and he collects it up, and it's kasher. So we'll say, so now listen to this. So the Gemara says, now, what does this have to do with our case? So we'll say, now watch this. The Gemara is assuming over here that when he spills the blood, what by definition occurs? The blood goes in front of him. Right? When he's spilling it, it's going in front of him. So to a certain degree, what's happened? The blood has been moved, but in a non-typical holacha fashion. Yet what does the Gemara say? That you can go ahead and collect the blood back up and resume. What does that seem to indicate to us? That an illegal holacha can be rectified. That's what the Gemara is doing with this case. An illegal holacha can be rectified. So the Gemara says, what's the case over here? Rashi says over here, maybe not. Maybe what it means is when the blood spills, it didn't spill in the direction of the Mizbeach. Rather, where did it spill? Backwards, or to the side. Meaning that the act of spillage did not in any way move the blood any closer to the Mizbeach. Because of that, it's not an illegal act of halacha. To which the Gemara says, come on, librai nafek legavaylo ayil. So is that possible, right? That you have such contained spillage that ultimately, again, it's going backwards, but it's not going forward. That's not generally how spillage works. To which the Gemara said, b'makom madron. It can be, if we're talking about over here, let's say where the Kohen spilled, there was a slope. So therefore, by definition, the blood flowed back as opposed to forward. Could also be, you're talking about a case where literally, again, the blood spilled into like guma literally means a pit, but rather, better stated, means like a depression in the ground. Or for that matter, we're talking about thicker blood, like a more like congealed blood, where it didn't splatter everywhere, but rather, again, it's contained. To which the Gemara says, come on. So that's it. So you're telling me now that this entire brayso is talking about such a narrow case of thick blood falling in a pit and a depression, blood falling on a slant, the spillage only occurring in one direction, not multiple directions. That just seems like such a narrow case that the brayso would be focusing on. To which the Gemara says, furthermore, that which we mentioned in the other parak, nishbach al haritzpa va'asfal pasal. Right? Ultimately, again, because the Gemara adds another ruling, which is that if the blood falls on the floor and ultimately the coin collects it back up, ultimately it's pasal. If that's the case, liflog b'didei, you could splice the case and analyze it on its own. How so? When is that so that the blood is pasal? Only if the blood splattered ahead. Aval nichnas lifnim pasal, but ultimately if the blood splattered backwards, there was no illegal halacha. Ultimately, again, it's possible. To which the Gemara says, tiyufta. Indeed, this is a refutation, ultimately, again, of ula. So I'll say, so again, so what's interesting to note is, so the Gemara refutes ula's statements, right? Ula said that halacha shelo beregel, ultimately, again, is pasul. Now, the Gemara wanted to suggest that, therefore, this refutes Ula's position. We'll see exactly, again, halacha l'maisa, how this figures into our greater context, right? So remember, we have Ula's statement of halacha shelo beregel, lo shma halacha, right? If you do halacha, ultimately, again, not with moving your feet, that's not called the halacha. The shaila is, if you have an illegal halacha or an invalid halacha, can that be rectified? Can that be rectified or not? So that question doesn't seem to have been answered yet. That's still open-ended. Okay, so let's see. We're going to get to the Rambam today, Meretz Hashem. Itmar, halacha shel b'regel. Ultimately, if you have halacha shel b'regel, so the Gemara says, machlokes Rav Shimon v'Rabbanon. That's ultimately a machlokes Rav Shimon and the Rabbanon. So the Gemara says, b'halacha Rabasi, the koli amalo pligi dipsula. So this is very interesting. So halacha Rabasi means like if there's a significant amount of halacha, or in a case where halacha is necessary because the Kohen is not close enough to do zrika without the halacha. Everyone agrees that we'll call it an erroneous machshava will invalidate it. Keep ligi. So ultimately, again, where do they have machlokes? Halacha zutrasi. But ultimately, again, we'll call it a small halacha, a relatively minor halacha. So the Gemara says machku alav ma'arava. So the Gemara says they laughed about this. They laughed about this statement in Eretz Yisrael because that distinction makes no sense. Because if that's true, so it says, what about a case of chatas ha'of? Now remember again, chatas ha'of is a bird offering. As we're going to see over here, the way bird offerings worked, and we'll get into all of this in Eretz Hashem, is they would shecht it right by the mizbeach. And remember, by a bird, there was no formal Kabbalah. What ended up happening with the bird is they would shecht the bird, and the bird itself, they would shake the bird and sprinkle the blood like that, right? As opposed to other karbanos, let's say animal karbanos, where they would receive the blood in a kli, right? Kli sharis, take the kli to the mizbeach, and then the kohen would dip his finger and sprinkle the blood like that. The bird itself was shaken, right? He did zrika with the bird itself. He sprinkled the blood onto the mizbeach like that. So alachata solf the psul b'machshava, Rabbi Shimon Heichim Mishkachas law. How are you ever going to have a case of chatas ha'of, which would become invalidated ultimately again through an erroneous mindset? If you do it before the blood comes out, i.e. before shchita, so a machshava is not going to invalidate it. The basar dinafik dam, and if it's after the blood came out already, it's avdale mitzvaso. Ultimately, the mitzvah has already been performed. My kusha, dilma mi de parish va'adamat lemizbeach. Maybe by chatas ha'of, and again, we're going to spend time on chatas ha'of as well. Maybe by chatas ha'of, the invalidating thought actually occurs between the time that you shake the bird, right, and the blood leaves the bird, to the time that it hits the mizbeach. Those, I don't know, whatever amount of milliseconds that is, maybe that's the time, that moment is where an illegal or an erroneous mindset, erroneous machshava, can invalidate the carbon. The ha, so this is actually very interesting. The ha, listen to this. If a kohen was sprinkling blood, and now watch this, the kohen's hand was amputated before the blood hit the mizbeach. So this is actually quite interesting, right? In this case over here, what's unfolding is something fascinating. So the kohen is going ahead and doing the zrika, and at the time that the blood, so right, he sprinkles it, and then as it left his hand, but before it hit the mizbeach, his arm gets cut off. Now let's say, what does that matter? Because well, obviously it matters to him, right? But lamaisa, the other piece that's important to understand over here is once his arm gets cut off, he's a bal mum. So the shaila now is the avoda a valid avoda? When the blood left his hand, ultimately again he was a fully intact kohen. Now, but yet by the time the blood hits the mizbeach, he is missing an arm. He's a bal mum. So the shaila is the avoda good or not? Va'amarlei psula. And ultimately, again, he passed in that it is possible. My taima v'hiza v'nasan ba'inan. Because also is actually quite interesting, because the lashon of the pasuk ultimately again is v'hiza. He will sprinkle the blood v'nasan al kanos mizbeach, and it will be placed on the mizbeach, which means that both the hazah, the sprinkling, and the nesina have to be done by the kohen. And by what kind of kohen? A kohen who is fit for the avoda. So fascinating. So the point was, so why is this being brought down over here? Because what do you see from here? What you see from here is something quite interesting, which is that halacha l'maisa, the avoda is only completed at the point that the blood hits the mizbeach, which then also tells us the same way that if the kohen becomes an amputee, between the time that the blood leaves his hand and hits the mizbeach, the avoda is invalidated. So too, if he sprinkles and then has an erroneous machshava, whatever, machshava psul for a different carbon, or machshava's pigul, ultimately, again, that will invalidate the carbon, which is really quite interesting. This is what they laughed about. To ultimately, again, do they not argue in the case of halacha rabasi, of a long halacha? So the Gemara says, "Vaha keep pligi bahoras." I'm sorry. Halacha rabasi keep pligi bahalacha rabasi pligi. Halacha lamaisa. When they argued, ultimately, again, they were arguing about a formal halacha, a real halacha. Everyone agrees that in what we'll call halacha rabasi, halacha zutrasi, which means a small act of halacha that doesn't really require movement of feet. Everyone agrees that a machshava psula will not invalidate it. Ki pligi halacha rabasi. Fine. Holicha zar v'chzira kohen v'chazra v'holicha. What about the following case? We're going to bring these all together because we're going to see the Rambam in just a few moments. But we'll bring all these cases together. Holicha zar v'chzira kohen v'chazra v'holicha. Also, what about the following case? What if a non-kohen? Now, this seems to be a case that we had before in the Gemara. A non-kohen did holacha. Now, I'll say again, remember, just let's build on the knowledge we have. What did we establish? Holacha is avoda, is a form of avoda. Therefore, holacha requires a kohen. And if a zar does it, if a non-kohen does it, it is pasul. Now, in this case over here, the non-kohen did holacha. V'chziru kohen v'chazra v'holicha. The kohen takes the blood back and backs it up and rewalks it. Now, Bosai, this seems to be the shaila that we had on the top of the amud of efshar l'takno. If an illegal holacha was done, can you rectify that? So that's what's happening in this case over here. Zar did the halacha, Kohen gets the blood back and rewalks it. So the Gemara says, so what's the halacha? So Amarav Simi Barashi, so the Divrei, I'm sorry. Second white line of Bosai. So Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yanai argued on this. They argued. So the Gemara says, Chad Amar Kasher, V'chad Amar Pasal. One said it's kasher, one said it's pasal. Mar savar efshal atakno, mar shavar efshal atakno. So we'll say, what is this machlok based on? Very simple. Can you remedy an illegal act of halacha? That's the shayla. So one opinion says yes, one opinion says no. So we'll say, it really so incredible. Can you rectify an illegal halacha? So you understand like the Musar Haskell implications of that. You go in a wrong direction in life. Can you go ahead and rectify that wrongful movement? And we'll say these are mamish tshuva gemaras. It's absolutely incredible. Now the good part is we don't know what the halacha l'maisa is. We definitely know what the hashkafa l'maisa is. Right? That even if in life, even if you have an illegal holacha, you take your life in the wrong direction, the answer is unequivocally clear. Efshar l'takna. You can always fix it. You can always fix it. As the Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, ad yom osecha, until the day that you die, you can always fix illegal holacha. Again, karbanas remains to be seen. Life, unequivocal, yes. So the Gemara goes right there. What about the reverse case? The Kohen did halacha, and then a non-Kohen went ahead and took it from him. Right? And then the non-Kohen did the halacha. So in case one, the Zar did the halacha, Kohen took it from him, and Kohen redid the halacha. In case number two, Kohen did the halacha, Zar took it from him, and then Zar rewalked it. So what's the halacha? To which the Gemara says very interesting. Amar of Singh Barashi, the Divrei HaMachshir Pasal. So we'll say, so according to the opinion that says in the first case, ultimately again it's kasher. We'll say in the second case that it's pasal, right? Because again, remember, essentially in the first case, if you say that it's kasher, it's because you say the second holacha is the primary one. Well, if the second halacha is the primary one, then ultimately, again, the first case will be kasher, but the second case, the second one is doing the halachas, the zar, it'll be pasal. The divrei aposal machshir, according to the one who says pasal in the first case, ultimately, again, we'll say kasher in the second case, because pasal in the first case, he goes after the first act of halacha, not the second one. So in the first case, the first act of halacha was the zar, second was the Kohen, therefore it's pasal. But in second case, first case was the Kohen, first halacha was the Kohen, second one was the zar, and therefore it will be kasher. Rava says, after divrei aposel, pasal. Rava says as follows. Rava says, even according to the one who says that we go after the first halacha, ultimately, again, we'll agree that in the second case it's pasal. My time, what's the reason? Because even in the first case of Oseh, even in the second case, even if you go with the idea that we look at who does the holacha first as the defining sacrificial holacha, in case number two, it's still going to be pasal. Why? Because in case number two, at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, the blood still has to be brought back to the mizbeach. As much as the Kohen brought it, and now the Zar walks it back. So whether you want to say, even if you want to say the first act is the valid act, at the end of the day, you still have blood that has to be brought back to the Mizbeach. And therefore, by definition, it is going to go ahead and be possible. Machlokes Rabbi Elazar v'Rabbanan. So this whole thing is really machlokes Rabbi Elazar v'Rabbanan. This is not. Rabbi Elazar Omer, listen to this case. Rabbi Elazar Omer, hamahalich b'makom shetzarech lahalich, machshava poselas. So also listen to this. If you do halacha in a place where halacha is needed, now remember again, we keep on coming back to this piece. As much as halacha is a bona fide form of avoda, and one of the avodas, halacha l'maisa, if you don't need to do halacha, you don't need to do it. In other words, let's say the Kohen shechts right next to the Mizbeach. So technically speaking, there's no need. So that's fine. That's fine. In other words, I don't have to do it. If it's not necessary, it's not necessary. So listen to this. If you're doing halacha in a place where halacha is necessary, then ultimately, again, machshava poseles. Therefore, an erroneous mindset, an erroneous thought, whether that's pigol or l'shem or different carbon, will invalidate the avoda. But But if halacha l'maisa, you have an erroneous mindset by halacha in a place where halacha is not necessary, it won't invalidate the avoda. Rava says, Hakol modim, kiblu b'chutz v'chnisu b'fnim, zeu hiluch shetzarach lahalich. Everyone agrees about saying a case where Kabbalah was done outside. Where's outside of both sides? So remember again, for example, let's say in the case of chatas pnimi. So shchita is done outside of the heichal, right? Outside of the actual structure of the Beis Hamikdash. So it's done ultimately, let's say, in one of the courtyards, and then you take the blood inside. That is called ultimately a necessary hiluch, because you have to walk the blood inside. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa zeh hiluch shetzarech. That's a necessary halacha, and therefore halacha l'maisa, an erroneous mindset will invalidate that. Kiblo b'fnim b'otzio l'chutz. What happens if, let's say, shchita and Kabbalah were done inside, and then you walked the blood outside? Zeh hiluch she'ein tzarech lahalech. That's unnecessary halacha, because it will say essentially what you're doing over there is you're taking the blood away from the mizbeach. And in a case like that, that's unnecessary, and therefore an erroneous mindset will not undermine the carbon in that case. Lo nechluku ela kishech niso v'chazer v'hotzio. Rather, what's the machlokes case? The case is where I both say, shechted the animal on the outside, you brought the blood inside, and then for some reason you took it back out. Mar savar hazar lim tuye. One says you have to bring the blood back. So because you have to bring the blood back, bringing the blood back ultimately is a necessary halicha. Umar savar lav kehilu chatzarach lavodadami. Other opinion says no. That second halacha, it's utilitarian, but it is not considered to be like a bona fide part of the avoda. Okay, Eisvei Abaye, Rabbi Lazar Amar, Hamahalech makom shetzarach lahalech. If you do halacha in a place ultimately or in a situation where halacha was necessary, so an erroneous mindset will invalidate it. What's the case? Ketzad kiblu b'chutz v'chniso lifnim. If you did Kabbalah outside and then you brought it inside to the Beis Hamikdash, again I will say, remember, inside means inside, let's say the heichal. So zeu hiluch shetzarach lahalech. That refers to a necessary hiluch halacha. But if you did Kabbalah on the outside, and then for some reason, again, Rabbi says, it's an illogical act, but somebody did it. They brought the blood back outside. Ultimately, again, that is considered to be an unnecessary halacha. The Gemara says, but 1 second. But as much as bringing it outside was an unnecessary halicha, the situation requires you to bring the blood back in. In other words, I understand that it's not a necessary halacha, but lamaisa it is, because the blood needs to get back to the mizbeach, to which he says, you're right, Amalei, Tanya. At the end of the day, if that's the version that you have, then go with it. In other words, that as much as when you take the blood out, right, the blood was inside, right by the mizbeach, and somebody took it out. So now both like, I understand the logic of saying the act of bringing it back in is not quote unquote like an avoda dik halacha, because at the end of the day, the blood was already on the inside. That's a true statement. But lamaisa, it still has to be brought in. So because it still has to be brought in, that is going to be considered to be a bona fide act of holacha. And if there is an erroneous mindset, that will undermine the effectiveness of the carbon. So I will say, let's spend a moment here just taking a quick look at the Rambam. So this is the Rambam in Hilchos Psulei HaMikdashim, Perek Aleph. The Rambam talks about a whole bunch of dinim of halacha. So let me just run through them very quickly. So this is halachas Chav Aleph, Chav Beis, Chav Zayin. So listen to this. So the Rambam writes as follows. So halacha number 1, the Rambam says, is that halacha is only kosher by a kohen. So we've established that already in part 1, right? So I'm giving you halacha information. Number 1. So halacha can only be done by a kohen. That's number 1. And therefore halacha l'maisa, if a zar, if a non-kohen does halacha, it is considered to be invalid. Invalidates the carbon. That's number 1. Next, the Rambam paskins, holacha shelo beregel ino holacha. That's in the Rambam paskins. That ultimately, again, if you do holacha without moving your feet, that is not holacha. That is not holacha. Therefore, leficha kohen gadol shekibla sadav v'amim b'komav v'zrakol lemizbeach nifsal zevach. Now, we'll say, now here's what's interesting that the Rambam does do. The Rambam holds that holacha is a necessary form of avoda, which means you have to walk the blood. You have to walk the blood, to the point that the Rambam paskins that if the kohen does Kabbalah and then does Zrika and never moves, never walks, the avoda is pasul. So, right, so therefore, again, this is, so in fact, number one is that, number one is that holacha is an avoda. Because it's an avoda, fact number two, it cannot be done by a non-Kohen. Number three, holacha shalo beregel, which means holacha of just extending your hand without moving your feet, is not called holacha, and a failure to move your feet as part of holacha will invalidate the avoda. Lastly, the Rambam, this I'm going to read to you. The Rambam says, he brings down some of the other cases, but we're not going to. Kol Zevachim shekibel damam echa min apsul ma'avoda. So we'll say, so what happens if halacha l'maisa, a non-Kohen goes ahead and, let's say, receives the blood, shekibel dam, right? Or shaholich estamal lemizbeach, or shezarko lemizbeach kilchaso, nifsah hazevach. Therefore, if a non-Kohen does any part of the avodah over here, right? A non-Kohen does Kabbalah, or a non-Kohen Azar does holacha. Such activities ultimately will undermine the carbon. Kibel HaKashar, Benasan L'Apostle, V'lo Hilech Ba'Apostle, Ala Am B'Mkomo, Yachzir L'Kashar. Now, both say, however, listen to this, Maise Itztava. If the Kohen, let's say, does the Kabbalah, right? Kohen receives the blood, and then he says to the Yisrael, hold this. And the Yisrael just stands there holding it, doesn't move, doesn't go anywhere, just acts as a pillar. Then ultimately, again, the Kohen takes it back, kosher. What we call in the Gemara Maise Itztava. Aval dam shalicho apostle avoda v'echziru l'kasher v'holicho o shalicho akoin tchila v'echziru nasal apostle v'holicho hol v'holicho apostle ben tchila v'besof nifsal zevach. However, the Rambam paskins, if the Yisrael is involved, or any type of apostle is involved anyway in the holacha, anyway, even if the Kohen takes it back, even if the Kohen walks it back, the avoda is invalidated. That is the halacha l'maisa. So if the Yisrael has any involvement at all, even if the Kohen goes ahead and gets back involved, so therefore we'll say, that answers our question. The Gemara says, can you rectify in an erroneous or an illegal halacha? The answer is no. The answer is no. Once you have illegal involvement in the avoda, ultimately the avoda is disqualified. And there is absolutely no way to go ahead and rectify. So halacha l'maisa, once there is an illegal halacha, the carbon is pasul. But as we said before, that is true halacha l'maisa in karbanos, not true hashkafa l'maisa in life. Karbanos, once you have illegal movement, you cannot rectify it in life. Once you have illegal movement, that's the moment that beauty of tshuva sets in, and we have the ability to fundamentally and profoundly course correct. And we'll say, Hadran Allah, Kol Zevachim, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, finishing the parak. We'll stop over here for today. Incredible. All right, Chabranzun, have a great day, everyone.